Hey everybody, it's Pastor Siri. I'm a Lutheran pastor and a spiritual seeker, and today I want to talk about something that is really important to me, and that is religious trauma. This is something that has just recently been starting to be studied and barely starting to be diagnosed, but a low estimate is that probably about a third of the people in the United States experience religious trauma or have experienced religious trauma. So I'm going to talk about exactly what that looks like. So please take a listen. So it might seem a little odd to you that as a pastor, I am really passionate talking about church trauma, but I just want to explain a little bit about that. I grew up as a child of a Lutheran pastor, and I felt like I had the best experience that someone could have growing up in a particular church. My dad and my parents were very kind, gentle, grace-filled people, and the community that I was in was a loving, sweet, small community where you really knew each other. There were no scandals. There was nothing weird going on. We didn't talk about hell. We didn't talk about the devil. We didn't talk about a lot of these things that can create a lot of fear in young people. It was really just, hey, God is love, and let's learn about Jesus, who talks about love, and let's try to love our neighbor as ourselves. That was sort of what I grew up with. But as I got older, especially when I started to get into junior high and high school, I began to encounter people who had very different religious beliefs, including people who had been harmed by religion. It was starting to get on my radar, and I was appalled and horrified at some of the things I was hurting. And as this continued through college and I had more conversations with people, it's actually what sent me to seminary in the first place. Was I wanted to be a pastor who was not part of the problem, but also I wanted to be a pastor who was creating an atmosphere for people where they could ask any question. Like nothing was off the table, and I would create a space for that. I wanted people to know about the love and the grace that was behind the institution of the church, something that I felt very, very strongly. And as I've continued to be a pastor, and I often go on a lot of spiritual retreats and interact with people who are not Christian, not in the Christian church, I have a lot of conversations with people who have been harmed by religion. And that has really informed how I present myself as a pastor, and that has really, really shaped who I am as a human. And I believe strongly that there is a deep spiritual wound in the entire planet when it comes to religion and spirituality and God that is just barely being talked about. And so this is like a whole book that I could go into that I may indeed write one day, but I'm just going to give you a very brief glimpse right now. So the first thing I want to do is to differentiate between three categories. So the lightest, easiest one is just called church frustration or community frustration. And this is just what happens when you're a part of any community with human beings. As I often say, we never leave our issues on the door. The chips on our shoulder do not fall off the minute we walk through the door of a spiritual or religious community. Intentionally, you have to work on them and be aware of them in order for that community to experience something more uplifting. But in the process, we're going to do or say things that will hurt each other. Even in convents and monasteries where people have chosen to be there and are dedicating their life to living consciously, there are moments in which people will hurt each other. A very little example of this was when I was on my internship in my early 20s. I wrote a musical on the book of Esther, and I was very excited to do this project, but one thing that I absolutely could not do, had no skills for whatsoever, was costumes. And we didn't really have a lot of costumes in the church. And so I just reached out to this huge church that I didn't know very well. And I said, who can help me make some costumes that would fit for this particular time period? And this woman stepped forward who was associated with helping with other plays. So I thought, hey, this is a great fit. And I described what I wanted. And as we got closer to the play, I didn't hear anything from her. And when we finally started to get towards our dress rehearsals, she didn't really have anything. And what she showed up with was not adequate at all. And I had a moment of just really feeling frustrated and let down by her. No communication, whatever. Like, it wasn't a big deal. Other people stepped up and fixed it. It's part of living in a community. It's no matter where you're going to be, you're going to have that, even if people are trying to do their best. She dropped the ball. It's okay. The next category up, though, is a little bit more serious, and that's something I call church hurt. And church hurt isn't traumatizing, but it can have people absolutely leaving the church. Church hurt is experienced by both pastors and members. This is oftentimes when people experience rudeness, they experiencing being unwelcome. This is young parents who bring a child into a congregation, and when their child cries or is making a little bit of noise, people are glaring at them. They might even say something. It's just this sort of feeling of like, this is not a comfortable place to be in. I don't feel supported here. But you can just leave. It's often sort of this medium category. So I've had an experience like this. I know a lot of pastors have actually experienced church hurt. And part of it comes from being in a community where you're being so vulnerable about who you are, and then to have people respond back to you in a way that's rude and kind of mean hurts. So an experience I've had a couple different times actually are anonymous letters that get sent to the church that outline everything that I'm doing wrong. But because they're anonymous, they can be mean, and because they're anonymous, there's no culpability. And that hurts, frankly. It's really not fair. It's not the way we should be. And often in cases like that, I will try to make some sort of mention generically, we don't do this in the community. This isn't healthy. This isn't kind. This isn't good. It's hurtful. But there's a third category here, which is what I wanted to talk about, which is religious trauma. And we've just barely begun to understand that this may be a phenomenon, partially because for so long religion was seen as normal, as important, as just people should be religious, you should go to church. And there's also such a feeling that because Christianity, I'm just going to use Christianity because it's been so dominant in the West and dominant in the country in which I live in the United States, that it was just sort of an expectation you went to church and that's what happened. And also with that was sort of this idea of, because it's a good thing, because you should be Christian, because it's the right religion, anything that happens in that context is okay, or you should just acquiesce to it. And we're starting to understand how deeply destructive that has been. And people have been leaving the church for decades now, often for very good reason, because of church hurt and church trauma, whether they were able to name it or not. So religious trauma is really when you're having post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, but there's no particular event. This is what trips therapists up. Therapists often do not know how to diagnose this because they'll see someone who has panic attacks, depression, clinical depression, and anxiety, who may be self-medicating, have deep feelings of worthlessness, but they can't figure out where it's coming from. They may potentially even have had a decent childhood, and they don't know there wasn't an event of a particular thing. Yes, some people have been victimized by a pastor or by a youth pastor. But interestingly enough, a large majority of religious trauma isn't about a singular event. It's more like being trampled to death by ducks. It is thousands of events happening week, month, year after year in ways people don't always consciously understand. And it comes down to this. One, it's fear-based and shame-based religions. And Christianity does not hold a majority over this, right? This can be from absolutely anywhere. When fear and shame and manipulation are the tactics, that is against whatever is healthy and positive. in humanity. And that causes trauma over time when you're in that much fear. And I believe very strongly that what is good and holy is lifting up and loving the self. And shame, where you're taught to hate yourself and doubt yourself and question your own thoughts, your own motivations, your own feelings, and feel bad about what you feel bad about what you think, feel bad about what you're doing, that causes deep, deep trauma within the self. And if you're told that questioning your thoughts, questioning your feelings, and that you're bad is somehow the way it's supposed to be, that is what God has ordained, that's what the Bible has told you, you're not going to pick up on the fact that what's happening to you is trauma, what's happening to you is wrong. So that's, again, why this kind of goes under the radar. Another part of what causes religious trauma is when people have no voice and they have no choice in what's going on, that's taken away from them. They're robbed of their own spiritual authority and their own sense of self-love. And so you may feel like something's wrong. You may feel like you want to do this, but you can't decide. And this has happened to a lot of people, children, but it's happened to women. Women have been denied, in Christianity particular, that's what my tradition comes from. Women have been denied voice and choice in the name of God for almost 2,000 years, and have also been told that is biblically mandated. And so when they have desires to live their own life, to become a pastor, to leave an abusive marriage, whatever it is, to get a job, to be equal to men, they're told that they are fundamentally wrong. And so when that choice and your own sense of who you are and your ability to be your own sovereign human being is robbed of you, that causes trauma because it goes contrary to what the soul wants. The soul wants to grow, the soul wants to learn, the soul wants to learn how to be independent, and it is based off of love of self, love of God, and love of neighbor. And when that starts to get torn apart, it causes trauma. I don't care what Bible verse you quote me, this is now becoming clinically studied. And so this is what's fascinating to me, is that people have hid behind authority and Bible verses to justify deeply traumatic behavior for a very long time. But now we are starting to actually get the proof psychologically and emotionally and physically and spiritually that certain things are wrong. Let's keep going. Authoritarianism, where you cannot question the person in charge, whether that's the man is the head of the household, you cannot question him. The pastor is the head of the church, you cannot question him. The Bible, blah, 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 blah. When you have this sense of authoritarianism where you cannot question that person, again, that can be traumatic because it means that your own sense of right and wrong is not being developed. Your own sense of what you like and do not like, what you can and cannot do, is being robbed of you. And that is contrary to what the soul wants to do. So that can cause trauma. And last but not least is, again, that sense of hierarchy, that sense that respect is obedience. And we see this in our culture. I've heard this as a criticism of many different cultures, even in police culture, that to respect a certain person is to obey them without question, rather than respect being something mutual that happens back and forth. That respect goes both ways, that both people deserve respect, which means listening and compromising and speaking things out. So as I said, I'm really passionate in talking about this because I believe that while this is a distortion of what community is supposed to be, it's a distortion of religion. It's in many ways manifestations of evil, and this can happen in any spiritual or religious community. It is not the way it has to be. I do believe that religious and spiritual communities can be absolutely healing and uplifting for people if you're in the right environment where people who are doing their own work, they're self-aware, there's accountability, there's consequences, there's a sense of leaders and members all in open communication with one another. Some people who've experienced church hurt and religious trauma have left organized religion and spiritual communities altogether. But some have actually found healthy ones, and they've gone in there and asked a lot of questions, and they've done their due diligence to make sure, is this going to be a place that's healthy and that supports me? Some people have become atheists and said, hey, because this community was so harmful to me, I believe that the whole thing is BS. The Bible is crap, God is like, all of it's junk. And you're allowed to think that. I'm not going to tell you you can't think that. But some people have said, no, I deeply feel there is a God, but that does not represent God at all. And I long to be a part of a community that will help me in my spiritual journey. And I respect that too. So if you've experienced religious trauma, if this sounds familiar to you at all, one of the things is I want you to just name and think about how that's true for you, and maybe look back on some of the things that were said to you and write down how they made you feel and what you felt was wrong. But I would also suggest that you would look for somebody that you can talk to about this, process it through. One of the things, as I said in the beginning, therapists have underdiagnosed religious trauma because they don't know about it, because they can't find a particular event that would have caused PTSD. But the other thing is that sometimes, because religion is so pervasive, therapists themselves can be biased without realizing it. Some therapists can be like, oh, good, you've woken up to the truth of religion. Let's be atheists together. And that may not actually be what you want. On the other hand, you might have a therapist who's like, oh, good, you understand how bad religion can be. Let me take you to the good side, to the good religion. And that may not be what you want either. So we need to have these conversations in churches, in places of worship. Therapists need to be having these conversations. All sorts of practitioners, spiritual leaders of any kind need to be having these conversations so that we realize that at the end of the day, what you believe is your belief. But let's talk about the impact of those beliefs. And when we're starting to actually get evidence that certain beliefs and ways of being as a community are inherently harmful to the soul, body, and mind, we need to repent of those and we need to change. And if we realize that there are some ways of being that are inherently supportive and uplifting to the body, mind, soul, and spirit, to me, that's like really huge evidence. And I can see this right now in the way that people from various religious backgrounds, the way they talk, the way they act in this country nowadays. I can probably tell if they've had religious trauma. I can tell if they're part of systems that are deeply harmful to them, whether they realize it or not. And those that are being supported and are part of communities that are life-giving and that are supportive and that are helping them to become the fullness of who they were meant to be. It's fascinating, and I'm going to talk more about what a healthy spirituality might look like in the next video. So thanks for listening, and I'd love to hear your stories and your comments below. Bye-bye.